Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the third installment of the 2023 Alameda Museum Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Rashid Shabazz, and I am the Vice President of the Alameda Museum, as well as the Chair of the Exhibitions and Events Committee. And really grateful that you all are either joining us live this evening or taking time to watch this online at a later date. October is Filipino American Heritage Month, and we're very fortunate to have some folks who grew up in Alameda, who are part of the history, have researched the history individually and collectively, and are going to be sharing some of that history tonight. And even more fortunate than their presence and their presentation is just the history of Filipinos in Alameda and the West Coast. And so it's an area that has not been represented very well by many of the historical institutions. And so we're really fortunate to have this effort here this evening. And so without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Claire and Leanne, who will share a little bit more about the histories. But first, I just want to give a quick overview of this series. And so just reminding y'all, again, this is the third and four for 2023. Tonight is celebrating migration, struggles, and contributions in Alameda. And then next month, we'll have the Muwekma Ohlone tribe will also be sharing. And so again, without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Claire Valderama-Wallace and Lean Deleon, professor, and as well as a communication specialist and Alamedeans or Alamedeans, as some of us on the West Side sometimes say.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rashid. Thanks to everyone joining and making the time. I know we're here to celebrate and to uplift Filipino American History Month. Also, just want to take a moment to recognize these are heavy times, right? And so invite folks to take a breath or two. We don't just see history unfold, we're actively part of what happens and what our descendants inherit from us. So inviting everyone here, whether you identify as Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx, mixed Filipino, etc., that you see yourselves and we see our communities in this living history, that we're contributing to it, we're inheriting it, and we're paving the way for the future together. And then I wanted to check if you're able to share your slides. So something a little bit about the roots of how we came together. So Leanne and I, as Rashid said, we both grew up here. We actually didn't know each other until just a couple of years ago. But while Leanne and I are the ones speaking and presenting tonight, this is really the work that emerged from a group of us coming together last year, feeling isolated, feeling disconnected, from just the world and things around within the context of the pandemic. But to be Filipino and to be a member of our diaspora is often to be separated from our own histories, including our histories here in Alameda and throughout Ohlone Territory and Turtle Island. And so I just want to give a lot of love and support and encouragement and just thanks to everyone who's part of the group who came together starting in April last year for an Easter egg hunt. So yeah, deeply rooted, celebrating Filipino AX migrations, struggles, and contributions in Alameda. And I'll pass it to Leanne. Leanne, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. I was like, can folks see the slideshow and me? And then I totally forgot to turn off the mic. I might turn off my video here and there just because my internet is a little sketch right now. But again, thank you, Claire, for welcoming us. Like Claire said, I know it's been a very heavy week for a lot of us that are kind of in the fight for social justice. And so really thank you all for coming and joining us. And we're just gonna dive in first to our check-in question. Sorry. And our question is, and I see that we don't actually, I think it's a small group today. So we hope to hear from everyone. But again, welcome. And our check-in question is, when you think of Filipinos in Alameda, what comes to mind? And so please share your name and your pronoun and answer this question. Claire and I can go first. Again, my name is Leanne. I use they, them pronouns. Part of the Alameda Island Filipinx that Claire talked about in where we formed 2 years ago. And when I think of Filipinos in Alameda, I think about my family. I think about the deep history that we've had here. My family has been here since the 70s. I came to Alameda in 1992 from the Philippines, but my grandparents were here for a while now. And so I just think about the families here, and I think about communion in St. Barnabas Church. I think of Encinal. I think of Parrot Village, which is the hood I grew up in. And so much of what Alameda is so intertwined with our family's history. Claire, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Claire, she, her, and sha are my pronouns. Two main things actually come to mind. One is Alameda Hospital. That was one of the hospitals my mom worked at. And I would volunteer there, but sometimes I would just go visit her and bring her food. And I would see so many nurses and staff around who were Filipino. Second, I think of Ralph's. Ralph's is where I would go with my mom and get pandesal, or she'd get fish, or I get like shrimp chips, just random snacks. And just that was, I don't think I realized when I was young how fortunate I was to be able to, go with my mom and just drive less than 5 minutes away and be able to get the food that, makes you feel at home. Cool. I just want to share what folks are putting in the chat. Thank you, Kaylee. Kaylee, she, her, and I think of food. We go to Neptune's on Encinal a lot and get banana lumpia. Maybe not the most authentic, I'm not sure, but it's delicious. Sweet. Thank you. And Rashid, I think of adobo and lumpia at Longfellow Elementary and Chipman Middle School as a child. Very cool. Yeah, our food is good. Anyone else want to check in the chat? You're welcome to as we kind of move forward too.
I know folks are being shy right now, but if you also want to unmute, yeah, let us know. We see some folks from Alameda Island Filipinx. So I see you. Gray, Joe, anyone else? So we're seeing some folks. Valerie, she, her, sincere healthcare workers in the area, very giving and helpful. Jen and Earl, being newish to Alameda, I was surprised to see such a strong Filipino community here on the island.
Cool. And also Gray, she, they. I think of family and my grandfolks who moved here from Manila in the 60s, and the food as well, of course. Cool. Oh, you learned tinikling as a child? Awesome. I never even learned it. It's awesome. Tinikling, that was even a PE standard in the small town you grew up in. Cool. Thanks, folks, for checking in. Okay, so something as Leanne figures out the slideshow sharing, I think it's important for us to also name the fact that there's a reason why these months exist, like Filipino American History Month, because they are so systematically removed from our consciousness, from our curricula. So to link this directly to the Filipino American History Month, our group planned and put on last October. This was crowdsourced and gathered from really rich Alameda history. And so these historical points and times are from that. And so you're welcome to even add if there are dates here and significant events in this timeline that you don't see reflecting your own family and experiences. Feel free to put it in the chat, because this is a living timeline that we're going to keep building.
Thanks, Claire, for that note. And as Claire mentioned, I think what we're trying to really show kind of in our time together tonight, in our very brief time, is to just give you kind of like a little overview, a little flavor of kind of the timeline and history of Filipinos into Alameda, both capturing our struggles, both in immigration as well as in housing. And a lot of this information actually comes from Rashid, who does an extensive history and knowledge of this. So thank you for that, your contributions, Rashid, of course, and also capturing a lot of our joy, a lot of the times that we've come together, and a lot of our successes as well. And so we really hope that we do some kind of justice to our folks and to our ancestors and to the island. And so with that said, we're just going to jump into it. Really just kind of trying to highlight some of the things. And so one of the things that folks might not know of that is that in the Philippines, it was colonized by Spain in the 14th or in the 16th century. And the first Asian people actually into what we know as Turtle Island or the Americas was actually in October 18, 1587, not too far from here. Is the landing of the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Esperanza in Morro Bay, which is near San Luis Obispo, was the first time Filipinos were here in the U.S. They were referred to the ships as Luzones Indios, or the Indians of Luzon, which is one of our islands in the Philippines. And that was because of the Spanish Manila Acapulco galleon trade, where because of our colonizers had Filipino slaves and indentured servants, these folks jumped off ship. And what we've learned too is that it wasn't just like a one-off. There was multiple folks that jumped off ship, but this one was what was recorded. And then also kind of in the late 1700s, to also show some history of Alameda, is when the Spanish arrived in what is now known as Alameda with the Ohlone tribe. Folks know in 1853, Alameda was founded. And then back to the Philippines, near the end of in the 1800s, Spain sold the Philippines to the US. And so that kind of then starts our colonization of America, along with Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam.
And if I can add, when I'm a nurse educator, and when I talk with nursing students, a lot of Filipino nursing students have to navigate, the stereotype, like, why are there so many of you who are nurses? And we can tie it really directly back to 1898 and the year after, when white American nurses went over to the Philippines. And so they worked together with physicians, with educators, and military, and really transformed the culture of health and wellness and workforce. And we'll get to that in a little bit.
Exactly. And I guess just as Claire mentioned, like, I think what folks put in the chat around, like, what do they think of when they think of Filipinos here in Alameda in the Bay Area, like, people definitely think of nurses. And so we hope to also show why is that the case. Yeah. In the early 1900s, there were certain acts, as the Philippines is now a colony of the US, that allowed for the migration of Filipinos into the US. And so at first it was college students, and then became kind of the systematic recruitment of Filipino agricultural workers in US and in Hawaii. So this was the first large wave of Filipino immigrants. Of course, as we've seen even now with migration, whenever there's kind of a changing composition of the makeup of folks, there is a backlash. And so there was a lot of white folks that were not really happy, and there was anti-Filipino riots. One thing that we wanted to highlight is in 1930, Philip Esteban owned and operated the Esteban Flying Service, teaching students from around the world how to fly airplanes. This was just in Alameda, near Oakland, the Oakland airport, I think. And then in 1931, we became eligible for US citizenship for folks who were serving in the armed forces or had family in them. And so I'm sure a lot of folks know Filipinos who are in America because of their military enlisting, such as my grandpa. And then these laws, even though we've served in the army, our ancestors did, a lot of these laws continue to restrict us and continue to show kind of the racist history. And so, for example, 1934, the Morrison versus California held Filipinos ineligible for citizenship. There was a quota. In Alameda, this is kind of one of the first histories we have of Alameda, is the Bohol Circle, which folks now know is an organization in Alameda, and has even a street named after them, and a park that they fought for. There were 16 immigrant men that established that in Oakland and then moved to Alameda.
Yeah, and then if I can add, I grew up literally 4 blocks from the Bohol Circle Center, and I did not know. So just to speak about how, we as Filipinos are not a monolith. So it was literally 3 or 4 blocks away, and I only knew about it because one of my closest friends in high school, her family is from Bohol, and so her mom was there all the time. And I never even thought to ask my parents, why don't we go there? Why don't you go there? So I think over the years I learned, just how distinct and diverse our peoples are. Like here in the States, people will ask you what's your ethnicity, and like I will say Filipino, but depending on who I'm talking to, I will say also I descend from Ilocano and Tagalog folks, right? So even, we're not a monolith here in Alameda either.
For sure. Thanks for clarifying that, Claire. And for folks who don't know, Bohol is a province in the Philippines. It's an island province, and so even within Filipinos, we know, because we all know we're Filipino, or so when we ask like who we are or where we're from, we tend to identify with our region or with our province. And so, like Claire said, like we didn't know unless you're from Bohol or have connections with that. Later on in 1941, the World War II, right? 1939 to 1945. The U.S. in needing more folks to be enlisted, basically opened it up, and so to join, to become military men. And so there were approximately 200,000 Filipino soldiers, including thousands from California, that enlisted. In July 1942, there was the first Filipino infantry regiment, was response to the desire for an all-Filipino regiment. And then later there was a second one, and some of those Filipinos, such as Mariano Marsan, who's from Alameda, was part of the Bohol Circle, enlisted to serve in the Pacific Theater. In 1946, so right after World War II, the U.S. granted the Philippines independence, and therefore immigration had continued to increase. Here, there was acts such as the War Brides Act, which allowed Filipinos that were married to U.S. Armed Forces to come into to the U.S. And there's some record that shows that some of them first made their first homes in farm worker housing on Bay Farm Island. And so in the second photo right here, this is taken from a book, if folks want to check it out. It's called Filipinos in the East Bay, which is created by the Filipino American Historical Society, that really captures such a great, tremendous documentation of our people in the East Bay. And so this is kind of taken from them. And so this, after World War II, created the second wave of what we call a Filipino migration. And it included nurses, students, veterans, folks who served in the Navy. Also, if folks have any questions, feel free to put in the chat or just interrupt me.
Actually, and if I can say something about that last slide.
Yeah.
So independence is in quotation marks, wondering if folks know why. There is a certain level of independence in terms of them not, them meaning the country, not being labeled as a current American colony, but in practice it continues to be. And we can see it today with the amount of US military presence. Culturally, there is so much reverence for all that is American culture. And so there's still very much deep economic, cultural, and political ties in terms of uneven power between the US and the Philippines. So independence was granted, but also not really.
Yeah, and then a lot of us in the movement or in social justice circles, we call it Philippine dependence because we're still very much dependent on our colonial master. As folks are learning of what's happening this week in Gaza and Palestine, how Israel is like the number one country in the world getting funding from the US military and government. It's actually interesting because in the Philippines, we're the number one country in Southeast Asia to get so much funding and US military backing. And that's because as a former colony, we're kind of positioned in a way to kind of check the growing military, economic, political power of China. And so that's why the US highly still depends on the Philippines in making sure that that they have bases and military buildup to have access to our country. And we can talk a little bit more about that too later. In the 1950s, the Bohol Circle, which at the time when it was founded, was just a group of folks just coming together, finally bought a parcel of land for $5,000. They had bought it from another Filipino, and so this is kind of them being able to kind of erect a building to have for as a cultural center and a community center. Also in the 50s, many families who lived in Bay Farm Island moved into nearby cities when their farmhouses were condemned. In 1960s, the Filipinos are counted for the first time in the US Census, and Filipinos in Alameda make up 1.1% of the population, with 715 residents. In 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which is very crucial to remember because this changes so much of migration. It increases the quota for family reunification, and so this prompted the third wave of Filipino immigrants. And so a lot of the Filipinos you meet now are actually because of this act where folks were able to be reunited with their family members, mostly the men that served in the military. In 1966, the Bohol Center moved to the address that we know now is in 1815 Union Street. And then back home in the Philippines, because we want to show like that things in the Philippines, just because we migrated doesn't mean that we're disconnected from them. In the 1970s, the first quarter storm takes place, which is basically students that were revolting against the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. And then in the census, again, it shows that we have an increase to 3.2% of the population, which is around a little bit over 2,000 in Alameda.
Yeah, so for folks here who identify as Filipino, curious, how you're reflecting and seeing your own lineages in this history. My mom came here in 1970. My dad came in, 3 years after that. And so what leads folks to move and to migrate? What are the conditions that they're facing? I think immigration, there's so much around better opportunities, yes, but why is there a need for better opportunities? What are the conditions back home? And really those conditions are continuing and in some ways worsening.
Exactly. So in 1972, this man on the right corner, monster, Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines, forcing many to seek political refugee status in the US because a lot of folks were being persecuted, a lot of folks who were even just speaking out, being concerned citizens were being maimed and disappeared and tortured. Also that year, Filipinos in Alameda came together to form the Filipino American Community Service Agency, or FACSA. The goal was to improve the quality of life, regardless of where you come from. They also were one of the folks that organized the Midway Homeless Shelter in Alameda, which is, I think, still in operation. They might have changed in the past COVID year, but in the 70s, the Philippines was going through a lot of political turmoil, similar to here in the US. And so in 74, the Marcos regime in the Philippines enacted the Labor Export Program, or LEP, to systematically export Filipino workers as commodities to work in other countries and use their remittances to finance the underdeveloped Philippine economy. And I think Claire will expand a little bit about this more, but this policy continues to impact us today. And this is why you kind of see Filipinos all over the world. You might watch like Britain's Got the Voice or Talent, and you see like a Filipino contestant, or you'll hear about Filipinos right now that are being sadly part of what's in the conflict happening in Israel and Palestine. You hear some Filipino overseas workers that have been sadly died there because the country is so poor that they have to be exported out as commodities. And also in our timeline, we kind of show some folks, Filipinos that are kind of getting established in Alameda, such as Dr. Benjamin Reyes in the 75, who put up his clinic across the Alameda Hospital, as well as other dental offices coming up. Claire, you wanted to add more, or?
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing, I appreciate you, you and Gray, for lifting up Midway Homeless Shelter. It just goes to show how there's so many layers of history we're not familiar with. So I went to St. Joe's K through 12, and every year there was a brown bag lunch day, right? Double bag, like bring another one. And then one day, I volunteered to go with, I can't remember her name. Maybe it's Shanahan. But I went with her to deliver the bags to Midway Shelter. And it wasn't until, that was probably in 6th grade, 7th grade that year. And now I'm in my early 40s, and I only learned that there were Filipino roots to that organization just maybe 5 years ago. So the learning still continues. So hoping folks, again, that you see yourselves reflected in this history and you can share it with each other and folks who aren't here. Speaking about labor export policy, it's literally what it is. The largest export are human beings, are workers. And you see this in so many ways. You can go to a big play area in Manila and there will be, imagine like a Boomers, but they're different rooms. Some of those rooms are, pretend you work in hospitality, pretend you are working in healthcare, right? And so Filipino kids are already being primed for the different ways that the workforce will push them out. And we saw this even during the height of the pandemic when things were shutting down. Of course, not every country had the same access to COVID vaccines. And so there was a point when really Duterte, who was the president at the time, said, here, Germany, we will trade. If you give us these doses of the COVID vaccine, we will export nurses to you, right? So that's why there are Filipino nurses practicing in over 50 countries. So when folks during the pandemic were, and not that it's over, but when folks were really talking about front lines during the pandemic, our front lines among Filipino communities wrapped around the globe, right? So I had Filipino nursing students whose parent owned a nursing home. They were in nursing school. They had relatives who were working or nursing students in Italy, in the Middle East, in the Philippines. So it affected our particular community in so many ways. And so that's why there's a disproportionate amount of death among Filipino workers, health workers. But literally, instead of addressing the root problems around why there's so much landlessness and less, opportunity for, a living wage and livelihood and safety, folks are pushed out of the country. And it's an active push out. It's not just like America looks better. It's literally is built into an entire ecosystem around visas, education. The education system was changed not too long ago to better mirror the US education system in terms of the timeline of grades. When I have been to different nursing conferences, I've met nurses who practice in the Philippines. Their textbooks are American nursing textbooks. So it's so thorough. It's so thorough, this labor export policy. And again, it's continuing. And so as conditions back home worsen economically, politically, we're going to keep seeing Filipino nurses, instead of being able to stay home and take care of, our folks in the Philippines, they're being pushed out. So that's just something to add to that context. And if folks have questions, please put it in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, and thank you for diving deep into that, especially for nurses, Claire. But the other industries that Filipinos are heavy in kind of this labor export and being sent over is in education. So there's a lot of teachers that come from the Philippines. Some of our teachers at NSNL are from the Philippines, engineers, construction, hospitality. And the reason why the Philippines continues to teach education in English, particularly just so that they can be more qualified to be exported into other parts of the world to serve kind of in the hospitality industry. So moving forward, here, and maybe Rashid can share a little bit more around his research. We really wanted to highlight that as Filipino immigrants, a lot being low income and coming out of the military, we faced a lot of housing struggles. So in 1978, the Makassar Straits, which was Alameda's last wartime housing project, which housed mostly Black and Brown residents, Filipinos and Black folks, because it's the only they can afford, was known as the slums of Alameda, had a lot of decay. It was met with a lot of fierce resistance in their closure. And you'll see that parts in some of our timeline later on too. In 1980, with the census, we reached 6.6% of the population, a little bit over 4,000. We want to uplift folks coming from our community who are now ancestors. Mike Dream Francisco, who was raised in Alameda, he starts to tag in graffiti. He becomes a legendary graffiti writer who found a home in the walls of Oakland, near 23rd Ave and East 12th. And if folks were at our event 2 years ago, or not 2 years ago, last year, we showed some of the Dream's artwork with his brother who works at NSNL. In 86, because of long and arduous struggle, both from people massively protesting as well as underground movements of armed struggle, the Marcos regime collapsed. And another highlight is my dentist, Dr. Tao. He opens up his dentistry, and that's him on the left. Some more changes throughout the 80s and 90s, more changes in around visas and who can come here as temporary visas. In 89 is when the founding of the Midway Homeless Shelter. Yeah. In 1990, we reached 8.7% of the population in Alameda, almost 7,000. And I'm sure folks know in 1994, Sampaguita, this restaurant here that still exists, is opened by Edna Rumacora. And some highlights in the 90s is also an increase in representation. Bubble Magic, which I didn't know prior to doing this timeline, as one of our members highlighted, is owned and operated by a Filipino. Dr. Barbara Galera, a dentist. In 1996, there was a really big change in this illegal immigrant reform act as kind of to criminalize and deport U.S. Filipinos if they committed crime. And also Tony Desog wins a seat in Alameda City Council, becoming the first Filipino and Japanese American to do so. He serves throughout, and I think is serving now. Yeah. We have baseball players. We in 1998, I want to really highlight this. Black residents, including Afro-Pinoy Lester Dixon of the Buena Vista Apartments, or the BVs, formed the West Alameda Tenants Alliance in order to organize residents to force the owner to improve the condition of the property. More about that, in July 2004, the folks from the BVs organized against displacement from their homes. After receiving notices of 1 to 3 months to move, many of the residents were Black, Filipino, Latino, and Arab families. They packed city council meetings and took to the streets. Unfortunately, even through their struggles, 386 families were evicted, displacing the largest Black population on the island. Sadly, one of the two deaths related to the termination was a Filipina grandma, or Lola, as we called them. And I guess I really want to highlight that because as folks, as I had a lot of friends and family that lived there, it was really, really unfortunate to see that go down. And you hear about how Alameda really wants to protect its diverse communities and especially folks that are poor, but you see time and time again that developers continue to win and buy up land and push people out. And unfortunately, this was really tremendous and a blow to our communities and the Black communities because so much of our people were pushed out of Alameda. And then in 2000, the population of Filipinos has decreased slightly, 8.4% of the population. And that's, well, because so much of the displacement and like lack of resources supporting them to stay in Alameda as it increases to become an expensive city, especially during the dot-com boom.
Yeah, and then if I can add, something that we are taught, I think it's also very gendered too. So daughters in Filipino families are often raised to, be people pleasers, be kind of quiet, do what you need to do, keep your head down. But the more we learn about Filipino history, the more we see that, we're sitting on centuries of revolt, of resistance, that we're fighters for housing, for land, for human rights. So just glad to have this all together and for this opportunity.
For sure. In 2002, Jessica Lacaba, or my geometry teacher, Antonella, becomes the sponsor of the Filipino American Culture Club. Just want to highlight that because, again, of the labor export policy in the Philippines that continues to push folks out of the country to find better living and economies, such as teachers like Miss Lacaba, who have to come and teach here. Fiesta restaurant was opened in 2007. That sadly closed. And so we're seeing that a lot of businesses that opened up are also closing due to the change of demographic in Alameda. In 2010, with the census, we further decreased our population to 5,400 residents, or 7.4%. In November, Rob Bonta is elected into the council and appointed as vice mayor. He serves until 2012. Another Filipino was elected into the city of Alameda Healthcare District, Dr. Stuart Chen, who then also later becomes part of the council. In 2012, I'm sure folks know, Rob Bonta becomes a state legislator representing Alameda. And then when he left city council, Dr. Chen became the third Filipino American to sit on the city council. Also highlighting other Filipinos that come from the island, the owners and founders of Lucky 37, Lumpia restaurant in Oakland that a lot of folks love, opened there. And sadly, we want to also lift up Kuya June, who I know some of our members know personally, and we have folks that are related to him, was murdered recently. In 2014, 3 streets in Alameda Landing are named after Larry Itlong, Philip Vera Cruz, and Bohol Circle. Bohol Circle, or Bohol Lane, is named after the Bohol Circle, which was what we talked about in the beginning of the timeline, the founding. And then Larry Itlong and Philip Vera Cruz are 2 labor leaders that organized under the United Farm Workers movement with Cesar Chavez. In 2015-16, you're seeing much more representation in Filipino in businesses and elected officials. Henry Awaya and the folks having in that West K Creations was on a Food Network show. Again, another point of history we want to uplift is around organizing Filipinos. Romel LaGuardia, Austin Durano, and Crystal Osorio, residents of the Bayview apartment complex on Central Avenue, which was mostly Filipino families, were issued a 60-day eviction notice a month before Christmas. I think talk about early Christmas gift, I guess. they were organizing against a big developer, Sridhar Equities. And also that year they passed the rent stabilization and limitation to protect folks to not go through evictions, but sadly we'll see that that's not enough. Malia Villa is voted into city council and she still sits in it. Other folks to highlight coming from Alameda, Benjamin Reyes II is appointed by Governor Jerry Brown as a judge for the Superior Court of Contra Costa County. He became the second Filipino American Superior Court judge in the Bay Area. And they're, from Ensenada High School. We have a principal that's Filipino. We have a plant shop that's Filipino owned. If folks are into some Filipino inspired beers, such as Calamansi, which is similar to a lime, but a little sweeter. Check out the Alameda Island Brewery, which is founded by one of our friends, Richard Angeles. And now as we're getting more recent, with COVID, want to lift up our friend and our deep comrade, Austin Tam, Alameda Filipino disability advocate. He's elected into the Democratic Party Council Central Committee, Assembly District 18. And then Claire, you want to talk about the nurses that organized?
Sure, yeah. So, everything really shut down February, March, and we knew things were happening. And I was still connected with folks at Alameda Hospital. And I'm also a member of Gabriela Oakland. And I reached out to folks at Alameda Hospital saying, how can we support? Of all places right now during a pandemic to work at a hospital, we knew that was, given that it's an industry, right? Profit over people, unfortunately, even in hospitals. We reached out, and so there's a demand for PPE, and we uplifted those demands. Safer work conditions, there were nurses there who, leadership pushed back against them when they said I shouldn't be taking care of a patient with cancer and also 1 or 2 patients with COVID. That shouldn't be my patient assignment. So we just really wanted to show up, and we showed up at Alameda Hospital at that time, April 2020, but also at a later time to help with a vigil and support where they named all the nurses who had passed away. I believe it was in the state of California. And we held a vigil with them, with the nurses there.
Right, and as folks know, as we were going through this pandemic and this, the death of a lot of our healthcare frontline workers, there was also the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black and brown folks all across the U.S. from police violence or racism and U.S. supremacy, white supremacy. And so in Alameda, school walkouts and street protests are organized and led by the youth. Vinny Camarillo and Randall Rubio, 2 Filipino high school Ensenada High School students, founding members of what is the Youth Activists of Alameda. And I'm sure a lot of folks have seen their posts, and we're taking following a lot of their leadership as we took to the streets. So really want to uplift the young Filipino youth that were doing a lot of that leading and organizing. Sadly, in August 8th, a lot of our businesses closed. I'm sure folks know Ralph's Market, which is a long time kind of sari store, meaning like kind of just local grocery things that you kind of run to if you need like a butter or some fruit or some lumpia wrappers. It closed its doors, and that was really heartbreaking as someone who's lived near there and has gone there ever since we've moved and supported it. And then you also have other places that did open up. Dina Ramorca opened the Preacher's Daughters, a cafe on Park Street, named after to honor her father, the late Pastor Vigilio Ramorca, who was the one that opened Sampaguita. And this is the other kind of rally the vigil that Claire mentioned in October. In 2021, more businesses embark Alameda with marijuana now being legalized, founded by Ryan Agabao, Filipino, and then historic with Rob Bonta becoming the first Filipino American to serve as California Attorney General. And this is kind of where our group was founded in April that year. Filipino families and friends from Alameda and surrounding cities gathered for Easter, and on June 11 for Philippine Independence or Independence Day, created relationships that led to the creation of us, the Alameda Island Filipinx. Vinny Camarillo was elected into the AUSD Board of Education. He was with us last year, but we're so proud of him. He's now in college in the East Coast, and partly where the title of our webinar today comes from was an event that we organized just in October last year, where we organized Deeply Rooted Alameda Island Filipinx American History Month that drew a crowd of 200 people. It had amazing speakers from Filipinos from all walks of life in Alameda that either have been calling Alameda home for decades or folks that are new there. We had some food, we had art, we had some music, and it was very packed with a lot of families, a lot of kids and youth. And we really saw from there that even though the population has been decreasing in Alameda, especially now that we don't have the Navy base, and especially now it's becoming such a expensive city to live in, that the Filipinos here still want to celebrate and come together as community, either to honor kind of our timeline here and to also continue to make more history. And then January this year, we organized an event that looked at migration and our families' stories of resiliency, and that was really cool too. And it drew in a lot of folks too. And again, it just speaks to the testament that folks here in the island still want to continue to come together and celebrate, or even organize together around the issues facing our community.
And something I'll add too about that migration event, we had a particular focus too, within the context of migration, but looking at seafarers. So when we look at the maritime industry, approximately 20% of seafarers around the world are Filipino, from the Philippines. And so labor export is not just sending folks, around the world who are trained in healthcare, but also folks who, are helping the maritime industry stay afloat. And we have the Port of Oakland that's right there, right? We see it. And if any folks go to the antique fair on that Sunday, or folks have kids who play basketball at the gym at Alameda Point, the port is right there, and it's so clear. And so, I don't know if folks remember the Grand Princess cruise ship, where the ship wasn't allowed to dock in San Francisco for too long. It turns out passengers were cared for eventually and tested and received treatment, but many of those seafarers working on that ship and having that ship go afloat, feeding passengers, etc., they weren't allowed to be to disembark and get testing. And so when we think about local issues, that's such a global one. If y'all ever look at marine traffic, I don't know if it's marinetraffic.com, you see a map in real time of all the ships around the world, and you just know that about 20% or even more are Filipino seafarers. So we're starting to look at, we're learning, we're studying, and we're trying to find out how we can support Filipino seafarers and just seafarers in general. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit.
Thanks for plugging that, Claire. And then, finally, thank you. Follow us on our socials. If you want to get involved, we're on Facebook as well as our Instagram. And this is an event that we want to plug in that we'll be supporting, organized by some of our organizations and comrades in the Asian Pacific Islander movement, API Resistance, Our People's Movements and Joint Struggle. I don't know if Joe, you want to make a plug for it, or Claire, or anyone else that's been involved in organizing this.
I'm pausing for a dream if you want to add. Thank you, Kaylee. Something that I'll say really quick about this is, even the term like Filipino or Filipino American came out of a need for political unity, right? For decades, it was like, I'm Cebuano, I'm Ilocano, I'm Tagalog. We speak different languages, very different cultures in certain ways. But even the term Asian American is a term that came from political unity during the Civil Rights movement. And so we're at a time now where we really need to keep learning from each other. And so there are folks who have visited their homelands recently or are very still in touch with the local global connections across our diasporas. And so this is a chance for us to learn and connect with each other, do some art, be creative, have lunch together, and just learn about each other's movements and struggles. So I hope folks will roll through. This is next Sunday.
For
Yeah,
sure.
my name is Jo, and I will share a little bit more about this event. So, as Claire and Lan mentioned, the diversity as folks may think about their identity as Filipinx people, there could be a lot of sometimes complexity or diversity in what we think about, like what does Asian mean? What does Asian American mean, right? What is API? What is AAPI, right? All the things. So we are inviting everyone who might have those questions, who have had those questions, to come to this event as we rediscover the richness of our homelands, our histories, what's going on currently in our homelands, and how we're tying what's going on locally to what's back in our homelands. And I just want to plug that there is a RSVP link for the tiny URL. And we are intentionally trying to make it more family friendly and little ones friendly. So also peek at the screen printing and there'll be some color pages. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jo, for plugging that event. And we really hope that folks can come out. Yeah, as we build up to counter this economic policy, this APEC that's going to further continue unjust laws such as the labor export policy that continues to see our people being sent over as like commodities.
Actually, no, let me build on that a little bit more because of where we are. Yes, we're part of the diaspora, but the Philippine government has a very particular and heavy presence here in the Bay Area. So we have a lot of power here as folks around of the diaspora. And there aren't any other events that we want to promote at this point besides this, because we're hoping folks will keep joining us and saying, let's do this, let's build this together. Hope, like I said earlier, hoping to do some work to support seafarers. And so to link to one of the questions in the chat, follow us on socials, share our message. I just read this book not too long ago, and this Indigenous scholar wrote, sometimes being in solidarity is like being among the folks, and also it means letting folks have their own space. I would say we're open to all of that. We want folks to join us. We want folks to also feel comfortable sharing our stuff, even if they don't identify as Filipino or Filipinx. But this is an effort we're hoping folks will join us in doing and in building.
Yes. With that said, does anyone else have any questions, not just for this event that we're plugging in, but from our presentation, or if you felt like you wanted to share maybe a story for you of being a Filipino or knowing a Filipino in Alameda, please do so in the chat, or you can ask to be unmuted. I know there's a lot of great folks on the group chat or in the participant list. I can share something.
Sure. So before folks may begin, I encourage y'all to continue on the chat and definitely not identifying myself as Filipino, despite all my ties. I just want to say thank you very much for sharing. I just wanted to make sure we shared that. And want to encourage folks to add any questions or comments here to the chat, and then I also will have some questions I'll ask. Let me start with this. So you mentioned a little bit about this process that you've been on, focusing on like coming together after the Easter egg hunt, having the event last year at Ensenal. And I'm curious, just how did you all begin your own journey of learning the history of folks?
I can start. Yeah, I'll start. For me, it actually didn't start intentionally until I was in my late 20s. When I was an undergrad, I didn't take any ethnic studies courses that were focused on API. I actually took Native studies, like literature, ethnomusicology, history. But as I took these courses with Indigenous classmates and faculty, I saw connections, and it was colonization. But it wasn't until I was I was living in Virginia. I was working and going to school in Washington, D.C., and it happened to be the centennial. And so there are a lot of Filipino scholars, writers, authors, artists going to DC to share their books. And so Louis H. Francia's book, Eye of the Fish, was the first book I ever read that was about Philippine history. And M. Evelina Galang's book, Screaming Monkeys, was the first book I ever read by a Filipino woman. And I will forever be grateful to her. And I fangirled all over her on Instagram when I first found her account, saying that that book changed my life. It changed my life. Yeah, so it's a couple particular authors.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, Claire. I didn't know about those books. I have to check them out. I guess I've always been really proud of the history of my people, and then living in Alameda and seeing so many beautiful brown faces and families, not just in the restaurants we ate at, but also in the schools that we were attending, but also in our churches. And so I've always been deeply trying to always like upkeep a kind of a communal kind of identity. But it wasn't until I got into high school at Ensenal, the Filipino club advisor prior to Miss Lacaba joining was Mr. Z, or Mr. Carlos Zalzita, and we have him in our extensive timeline, but we kind of just didn't want to pack so many of the slideshows with so much words. So sadly, we took him out. I hope he's not on this chat. But Mr. Z was really cool. Was all about kind of brown pride, kind of he also got like kind of politicized in the 70s and 80s, and so he told me to get involved with Filipinos for Affirmative Action, which is a nonprofit based in Oakland that now goes by Filipino Advocates for Justice. But at the time, FAA, Filipinos for Affirmative Action, had an internship for high school youth, and so I interned with them, as well as APAL, which is the Asian Pacific Islander Youth Promoting Advocacy and Leadership. They had like this joint program, and it was a year of kind of both education, of unlearning so much of what our white supremacist education taught us, and really rooting ourselves in this history of struggle, especially with the Philippines, that our folks have been resisting empire and colonization since 1565, often armed, right? And so that kind of really politicized me, and this internship program also taught us a lot of organizing tools. And so I was very kind of like a young person, really itching to kind of organize and get folks involved and unlearn so much what we're taught, and as well as like campaign. So that's kind of how I got around. And so I think, just going back to your question, Rashid, like a lot of us kind of came together looking for a community, even if it's just a social one. And I think that's what the Easter hunt was. Like a lot of folks wanted to just bring their kids, especially most of our members are, our parents taking care of little young ones. So how do we continue to organize amongst ourselves? That's multi-generational, that's open to folks from all identities within our expansive Filipino and non-Filipino identities that we carry, be it our gender identity and expression, be it kind of where we're from in the Philippines, our immigration status. Like, I think it's cool that we have this place. And so for folks that are in the chat that like are looking for a place to get involved, we're definitely here and open, and let us know. We're having like a dinner on Friday, or this Friday. So if you want to join us just to kick it and hang out and celebrate Filipino American History Month, we'd love to have you with us.
Awesome. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, go for it.
We're just we're gonna say that there's a question from Joe. I haven't been to Alameda Museum yet, but are there any exhibits mentioned about the immigrant communities of Alameda history? And that's a great question, Rashid, because Rashid is our Alameda Museum man. I never knew about the Alameda Museum until Rashid told me about it, so I'll let you handle that one.
Sure. So I was at the museum. Wow, that was yesterday. Okay. There are very few references to some of the immigration people who've immigrated. I do not recall anything that explicitly referenced a range of the folks who have immigrated to what's called Alameda. However, this event is a part of an effort to ensure that the Alameda Museum is more reflective of the different histories that exist in Alameda. I wanted to so thank you for that question or demand if it needs to be. I think that's a great point. Uh, the question I like to ask. So I just read a comment. People recognize me in the chat. All right, I see you right on. So I wanted to ask this question actually from Valerie, and I can come back to my own question. Um, so Valerie, our museum president, asked, "How did the closing of the Naval Air Station, or the Alameda NAS, affect Alameda's connections to the Philippines and the connection of those living here?" And the second part, did the Filipino community change in Alameda?
That's a great question. I'm just trying to remember. Do folks remember when the Naval Air Base closed? I think it was in
Yeah, it was
9
1997.
97, yeah. And so from what we saw from the closing of the naval base is that so many, is particularly on the west side of Alameda where the Navy base was, it created such an economy, and it created such a housing and cultural center that brought in so many Filipinos here and so many other communities of color, particularly like the Black communities. And so a lot of the family reunification that we highlighted in our timeline, folks moved to the west side. For example, my grandpa served in the front in Guam, and so when he migrated here to Alameda, he, through his reunification act, was able to bring all our family, which was like 9 families, into Alameda. And so we saw that growing kind of in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s, and we saw an increase in kind of in Filipino families. And then sadly, when that closed, it kind of took away an economy that so many Filipino families depended on. And so you saw folks, shifting into different occupations. So at the time, my grandpa then became a custodial worker. And so a lot of the labor that a lot of these Filipino families, particularly men, kind of transitioned into were a lot of kind of quote unquote like low paying work, because particularly after they were used in the military, they kind of disposed in figuring out what was next for them. A lot, I know, like, and one of the highlights of our community that we're still fighting for to this day is the recognition and the payment for a lot of our manongs, which means older older gentlemen who served in the military in different capacities, yet because of the changing status of Filipinos as citizens, or as residents, or as colonial subjects, some of them never benefited from like the veterans resources. So a lot of them don't get a monthly paycheck like a lot of the veterans that do now, despite their contribution, and despite a lot of them, aging out and are dying. They're like in their 90s and even in their hundreds. And so I think there's only maybe even like a handful of them only left. And so with the closing of the Alameda base, it really changed a lot of the economy and the demographic of us. And so a lot of the Alamedas did move out of Alameda, and we saw that with the census trends of, we can particularly locate it due to major events such as the Navy base closing, that so many of our population has decreased.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then just also just lifting up something you also referenced earlier in during the .com sort of boom, the late 1990s, with the Filipino population that would attend St. Barnabas. There was a lot of organizing that was also taking place around there related to housing because there were a number of families that were being displaced around that time. No, I'm curious. You just talked about this colonial relationship from first the Spaniards and then the U.S. after Philippines fought the Spanish, and then Alameda having this sort of Spanish colonial heritage too from Spaniards. And so I was curious, what other connections do you see just related to, these histories of colonialism?
I can start, and then Leanne, if you want to join. I mean, there's this thing we call colonial mentality, right? There's so much that we're often raised to embody certain values and ways of looking at the world. But when you start to learn more about our history, we can tease out those are actually tendencies and ways of thinking that came from the colonizers and or came from surviving and navigating colonization. And so, I mean, a super concrete example is, the jobs that Filipinos take around the world, but also in our language. And I mean, there were over 70 different languages spoken in the Philippines, and the degree of colonization by the Spanish shapes the degree of how many words someone who only speaks Spanish can understand. Like Cebuano, for example, is very heavily, Spanish influenced. And actually I brought this up in class maybe in September. Some students were joking about one of their classmates was gossiping in clinical, and they used the word chisme, and they're like, oh, the tea. And I was like, chisme, we understand what chisme means because in Tagalog, chismis is gossip. So even just linguistically, there are very, clear connections. But you can also see it in our food across all of our different, you see Chinese influences, you see Japanese influences, you see Spanish influence. And so you can see in our food as well, but also colonial mentality and also our language.
For sure. Thanks for starting that, Claire. Yeah, there's so many deep connections. I think also around culture and language is also like religion. Philippines is like the only country I think in Asia that is Catholic. It's more than 95% of our population, and so a lot of us are raised Catholic or even culturally Catholic. I know a lot of us grew up in Catholic churches. I know Claire went to like St. Joseph's, I and St. Barnabas, and so that is definitely kind of deeply felt with a lot of folks that were colonized by Spain, particularly here as we navigate in the Bay Area. So many of other brown communities, particularly like the Mexicans, come from Catholicism, and so we find that also as areas of connection and solidarity, in the sense that we are able to speak to each other because of our faiths and our upbringing, and really tapping into coming from Latin America, the liberation theology, really using the teachings of Christianity to really organize for the poor and against oppression. And one of the things when we think about colonization from Spain and then our current colonization with the U.S., we're seeing the U.S.'s expansive reach into becoming the number one imperialist power in the U.S. and in the world, and its fingers all over the continents in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And because of that colonization, we're also bound to other people that are oppressed and fighting resistance. And I know that right now, as Filipinos, we stand wholeheartedly with what's happening in Palestine, and particularly the folks fighting against genocide and ethnic cleansing, knowing very well that the Israeli Defense Forces and military empire there, it comes to the Philippines and trains the police there and supports a lot of quelling the resistance happening in the Philippines as well. And so as much as our colonizers and oppressors come together, we too, as oppressed people, as brown people, as Black folks, folks that have deep history of being colonized also must support each other wholeheartedly.
Mm. Thanks, Leanne. If I could add to, part of that erasure is what Gray posted in the chat is when you help an entire community and group of people not know their history, not know the strength of their histories, and that is our mythology, right? So my kids come home, they talk about, they're learning about Greek mythology and Roman, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's just the canon of American education. Where's ours? But at the same point, I can't even speak to Philippine mythology. So the book I named in the chat just came out last month, and I'm gonna read it with the kids because I don't have a deep grasp. And my parents are of the generation where their generation was fully educated by an American-built education system in the US. So they learned A is for Apple, right? They learned English. And there are still universities and schools in the Philippines where if you do not speak English, you speak your language, multiple languages, you can actually be fined. It's still in the policy books of those schools, of those universities. It's not necessarily enforced. But that colonialism exists all in multiple layers. But when we don't even know the strength of our non-binary, of our queer, ancestors and in mythology as well as so I think there's just so much that's erased that we need to reclaim and remember. So I have a lot of appreciation for cultural workers, authors and artists who are keeping these truths and histories alive for us. So thanks, Gray, for lifting that up.
Yeah, thank you for the response. Just building on that point, particularly around colonialism and education. When I was an undergrad at Berkeley, there was an effort that emerged to rename what was in David Prescott Barrows Hall. David Prescott Barrows, a former UC president, was a political science professor, and was a part of suppressing the 1934 waterfront strike. Had some very disparaging things to say about West Africans and Berbers, but was also part of the colonization of the Philippines, particularly around the educational system. And so just seeing how, certain individuals can be involved across, multiple contexts, I think Leanne broke down. I'm curious on this education piece. I got two questions for y'all. One is, Leanne, you mentioned earlier about unlearning things. I'm just curious, what was taught in the schools, if anything, related to Filipino American history? And you also mentioned, like your folks' education. I'm curious if stories were shared, what kind of stories did your parents or maybe grandparents also share about your histories?
Oh, thanks for those questions, Rashid, and also bringing up the fact around David Barrows. And I'm going to try to answer them, tying it all up, because as you mentioned, David Barrows is an extremely problematic American architect, US imperialist that was in the Philippines. A lot of what was created with the University of California, particularly Berkeley being the flagship university of public education in California, was mirrored into the creation of the University of the Philippines system back home. And so a lot of the education, as America granted us our independence, one way to keep its influence and strings as they puppet us is really creating an education system that uplifted American. It was kind of like they sent similar to a lot of boarding schools that happened here with the native population, was they sent a lot of American and white teachers to come into the Philippines to teach us about our own people, our own places, our own culture, and of course erasing a lot of the resistance, erasing a lot of the times that Filipinos actually pushed back. And so a funny example that we always mention is that in the Philippines, we learned an A is for an apple, even though apples don't grow native and are not even accessible to a lot of the local population because the apples that are there are either exported and mad or hella expensive. And so instead of teaching A is for atis, which is one of the local fruits, delicious white meat kind of fruit, exotic fruit, where we learn an apple, and that's because of architects such as David Barrows, who, I'm also happy to say, finally, after years and years of students organizing both in the Filipino and Black community, that they were able to finally take down that racist white man's name in naming the building. And so I don't know what they renamed it now, but particularly, I think, going back to what Claire's point is that a lot of us grow up with kind of a colonial mentality. And so unlearning so many of that is such a struggle, especially when we are living in the belly of the beast, growing into a very white supremacist education system and consuming so much of Western media. A lot of that things that we learn as kids around even just our own selves and other people are framed through those lenses. And so I remember in high school getting in a fight with my AP US history teacher because so much of the one paragraph that talks about the Filipino American War was just reduced to basically America liberating the Philippines from Spain and never highlighting the resistance that the Filipinos fought against Spain, against the Japanese, against the Hukbalahap, which are folks that took up arms to fight for independence. And it just kind of shows this benevolence that America granted the Philippines. And every time it showed kind of the Filipino American War, it was just reduced to a couple sentences that, like there was this small feud, and then, the Philippines won their independence, but it doesn't talk about the genocide. If we're hearing so much genocide happening right now in the news in Palestine, like it doesn't talk about the genocide of the Filipinos, how in Samal Island, boys that anyone that was above the age of 10 were massacred, killing 75% of the population on the island. And yet we don't talk about those in the history books. And then when we do talk about them, it's reduced. And we're seeing that now because colonial projects need to thrive off of the erasure of so much of our history and a rewriting. And sadly, we're seeing with the new elected president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the dictator, he's continuing to change up history and revise it to erase so much of the horrendous things that his father's administration did.
Thank you. Claire, did you have anything that you wanted to add as far as either what was taught in the schools when you were growing up here in Alameda, and or the stories you may have heard from family members?
Yeah, you know what? I think because of, Leon brought up genocide, when the victors and colonizers get to name the dates of when a war ends and begins, everything after a specific year was deemed an insurrection. So, our textbooks are garbage. There's such unscientific, incorrect information in the textbooks. I remember taking AP history and I was like, what is this? And so just really, how do we check our textbook industries? They're an industry. So thinking about that, and it's true. Nursing textbooks also have really unscientific, harmful things. But I would say in terms of stories I heard, I really had to ask my parents for stories because they're really just, I think of quote unquote comfort women. There are histories that are erased and histories that people who survive the unthinkable try to share, and folks still continue to silence them. So there's also a deep history of quote unquote comfort women in the Philippines and across the Asia Pacific region. So a lot of points for unity and solidarity, I would say, in terms of erasure of history and colonization.
Thank you. Are there any other questions folks have from the audience? I have a few more before we close out for the evening. Want to make sure we give an opportunity for folks to share.
I got a question from a direct message. It's I think one coming from the young. How can young people get involved with how can young people get involved with the group and then throwing events? Yeah, just come out to some of our events or get plugged in, come to our dinner. We would love to have you. We would love to partner with any of the youth, particularly the Filipino clubs at Ensenada and Alameda. I know that's something that we still have to find contact with in Alameda High School, but yeah, we really want to continue to be mentors and guidance for the youth.
And if I can lift up, Leanne mentioned the first quarter storm. We can't forget that we ousted a dictator. And the youth were instrumental in that youth leadership. So I just want to, yeah, just welcome youth. Your sharp eyes and your energy are needed in all struggles for justice.
Yes, we need the youth, especially in shaping what's to come next. Like I mentioned in the timeline, a lot of the Filipino youth were involved in the founding of youth activists for Alameda as they walked out of high school. And just another plug I saw from social media, a lot of youth all throughout the Turtle Island or the US are walking out on Wednesday in support of CASA. And so if you're a high school youth and want to get plugged in, check it out. Our comrades at the AROC in San Francisco Arab Resource Organizing Committee are helping support that.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And just building on that point about young folks in particular, you mentioned young person Vinny, who was a co-founder of the Youth Activists of Alameda. And that's also a person who perhaps got one of their early experience organizing as a resident of 470 Central and dealing with the forced evictions there. And so there's these long and interconnected journeys and trajectories. So I really want to appreciate you both for sharing just part of the history, and we know it's so much more. And I hope that you'll get get a museum trip in, because we want to make sure that more people are aware of the Alameda Museum as a resource, and it's definitely inclusive of the various histories that exist. Histories, her stories, our stories. I want to share a couple slides really quickly with folks. Again, thank you for coming to this virtual speaker series for 2023. And just want to again give thanks to Claire and Leanne for sharing part of this history. Again, just a year ago, this grassroots effort continues to grow. So from doing it a collective history to then sharing some of those threads of history tonight with the Alameda Museum, and hope we're able to continue to lift up this history. There was one figure I wanted to share with y'all when we were talking about Alameda Filipinos, Afro-Filipino well-known producer, Trackademics, Jason Valerio. So even though he's from, for me, the other side of town, excellent producer, musician, and great educator. So shout out to Trackademics. You all shared a few different texts, so I wanted to make sure we lift these up and folks read those this month, especially because it's banned book month. But The Journey for Justice, focusing on Larry Leon, and the Empire of Care, dealing with nursing and migration, that was also mentioned. And then lastly, Filipinos in the East Bay. And so for those who may recall, last year we had a few speakers in May as part of Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And one of them was the co-author, Lilian Galledo. And so just want to encourage folks to go check that video out to learn more about part of the history. And then lastly, again, this is the third of our 2023 series, and we have one more event happening on the third Monday of the month of November. So on November 20th, we'll be back here on Zoom, Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, Preservation, Recognition, and Sovereignty. And we'll have Charlene Nijme, who's the chairwoman of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. And I'm really grateful to have her as a part of Native American Heritage Month. And that's the little slide about that. And just in case folks are interested in getting more involved with the Alameda Museum, there's different opportunities to get involved, but one of them is joining the board of the Alameda Museum. And so if you're interested in learning more about that opportunity, you can speak to myself or other board members, and you can send an email to volunteer@alamedamuseum.org, just expressing your interest. And we are also in the process of hiring an executive director, currently seeking an interim executive director. And you can get more information about that by emailing info@alamedamuseum.org or talking to one of the board members as well. And of course, want to encourage you all to join the Alameda Museum. You can get more information at alamedamuseum.org. alamedamuseum.org. That's alamedamuseum.org. Again, thank you for coming out this evening for the 2023 virtual speaker series, and have a blessed night. Oh, I should say, for coming out. Salamat po.
Thanks so much, Rashid. Thanks, Alameda Museum.
Thank you so much.